Hello people, welcome back to Everywhere Tools. If you're thinking of starting carpentry, or you know somebody is thinking of starting carpentry and you're thinking about starting a toolkit, then today we're just going to be looking at some basic hand tools that will help you to get started. So I've got my tools, got my tea, let's go. So I've just put a basic toolkit together of hand tools, which is kind of what I started with some 29 years ago when I started my apprenticeship. The company that I was working for gave me a set amount of money, and the guy I was working with, we went to the shop and we bought like a basic hand toolkit. So I've kind of put some of that together now. I mean, some of the things that aren't here, which I had to start with, you're like, you know, the old Yankee screwdriver that we used to use, the pump action ones, which, you know, we didn't have impact drivers then. Also, I would have like a brace and bit, which, you know, we do all our drilling with, drilling locks out with those. So there's things like that on here, but yeah, some of the stuff is from back then, and there's a few added extra bits as well. So let's get a look, let's get started and have a look what we got. So I'm going to go through some of these fairly quickly and some into more detail. But we'll start with this, the old trusty hammer. So I've had this is probably the second hammer that I've had throughout my career as a carpenter. It's one of the things that's worth investing in, I'd say, spending money on. This one is a Estwing. It's a 22 ounce, I think, yeah, about 22 ounce. So what I would say is don't buy the cheapest hammer you can find, but you don't have to go to town on a major expensive one. And also find a nice weighted one. So you don't want one that's too light, that's going to be hard for hitting, you know, hitting nails in or whatever. And also you don't want one that's too heavy for if you're doing a lot of over the head work. You don't want like a 24 or 26 ounce hammer. So I kind of gone for a 22 ounce, and I find that that's sort of good for both, you know, both ways, hitting down or hitting up. So yeah, I would say invest in a good hammer, and it's one of the tools that you want it to last throughout your career. Like I say, I've had this one for over 20 years. And yeah, after a while it just feels like an extension of your arm. You get to know the weight, the feel of it. Yeah, so that's the hammer. So just quickly, a couple of things that I always have on me are pencil, which, you know, you get these free like from different places, or you can just buy them really cheaply. That's always with me. I use a bigger one for when I'm doing roofing and like first fix, and then if I'm doing second fix and kitchen fitting or whatever, I use a smaller pencil. Also, a knife is always on me, always on my pouch, always on my person. I've had different types, you know, quick release ones, flip ones, but I always find myself going back to the old basic Stanley knife, which just does the job, and it's, yeah, just does what you need it to do. Next we come to the tape measure. So tape measure is one of those things that you are going to have a few of, because you're never going to keep one for like 20 years because they just break, or you lose them, or you drop them, or they wear out. So normally I go for something that's about 8 meters. I don't normally go for anything more than that, just because they're heavy to carry about, and if you're going to go do something that's 10 meters long, then, you know, there's other tapes that you can get specifically just for that reason. So I normally stick with about 8 meters. The only thing that I do like with a tape measure, my tape measures, is I still have inches on one side and metric on the other side, just because when I started everything was imperial. and now we moved over to metric. The only thing else I look out for on my tapes is on every 400 mark, you'll see that it's in it's got like a red block square around it, which I kind of like for marking out. When you're marking out joists every 400, it's just a little bit easier to know where your mark is, just so that you're double sure that you're not going to get it wrong. So that's the tape. Moving on next, square. You always need a square. Very, very handy. This one's like a combination square that slides backwards and forwards. You can get a fixed one if you want. So I use this quite a lot for setting things out, setting out stud walls, obviously squaring off timber, things like that. You don't need to spend a lot of money on one of those, but it's worth getting a decent one that you know is going to stay square and is not going to rock backwards and forwards once it's tightened up. Moving along the line now, we come onto the planes. So I've just got this jack plane that I use, number 5, Stanley one. I've had this since I was an apprentice, so this is the only jack plane I've ever owned. It's not a majorly expensive one. It hasn't got like the wooden handles to it. They're plastic, but it's done the job. I use this quite a lot for if I'm shooting indoors, then I still like to use the jack plane just to finish off. I use the electric plane to get the door to size, but I like to finish it off with a jack plane just to get rid of the sharp edges, and also just to get rid of the ripples that you get from using an electric plane. Yeah, so a jack plane is very good to have, or a smoothing plane. You don't have to have one as long as this, but I find that this one's kind of good for both, for bigger stuff and smaller stuff. And then also with that, I have a little block plane as well, which I use for smaller things, mainly for taking edges off or doing small rebates and things like that. I did spend, this isn't the first one I've had a couple. The one I had before I dropped and it sort of cracked at the front, so I've had this one about 15 years, I suppose, 10, 15 years. I spent a bit more money on that. It's probably worth more than my jack plane. It's a good solid heavy one. Yeah, so it's just, I think this is just one of those other things that as a carpenter I think it's worth spending a bit more money on getting a decent plane. I mean, you can really go to town on one of those and spend a fortune, but this one's, it wasn't cheap, but it wasn't hugely expensive. So I'd say that's definitely a must to have in your basic hand tool kit. Continuing along the line then, we come to the chisel set. Now a chisel set is another one of those things that you kind of buy as a carpenter, and it's one of those things that you keep hold of just because you use them all the time, and it's just something that you get used to. I mean, this set, I've had this set since I was an apprentice, so back in 1990, 91. This is the only chisel set I've had. I just keep the basic 4 in this bit roll. They weren't expensive ones, because the company I worked for didn't have a huge budget to spend all on chisels, so I just got these Stanley ones, but they're nearly 30 years old and they've done the job really well. I think you can still buy these actually, but I'm not that sure about, I don't know a lot about the hardness of steel and on chisels and things, but I'm guessing the ones that you can buy now will be the same hardness of steel. They've lasted forever. You can probably tell that I've only got 3 actually in this bit roll. So I've got 1/4 inch, I've got 1/2 inch, I've got an inch chisel, and there should be an 1 1/4 one here. But I've worn that one down because I used it so much in the 29 years that I've had it. But then recently I dropped it down the cavity of some house, so that has gone forever, and which was quite a sad day, because you know, I had it that long and I know it needed replacing because it was down to its nubbin, but I don't know, just keep using it. So I am going to be purchasing very soon a new set of chisels, which is kind of exciting but kind of a bit sad at the same time, because yeah, this is like seen me all the way through my career. So I'd say if you can spend, you know, a decent amount of money on a set of chisels, then do that, because that is something that you want to keep and that you want to treasure. This is just a cheap old bit roll that I got at the same time, just to keep them separate and clean and stop them getting kicked about. You don't need to spend a lot of money on one of those. And then also with your chisels, at some point you're going to want to sharpen them. So I've got here a diamond stone, which is very, very fine. And also this has lasted me, I must have had this 20 years. And it's still as good as when I bought it 20 years ago. So I just keep it in this leather pouch that come with it, and it's relatively inexpensive. I didn't spend a lot of money on it at the time, but it sharpens them up really well. So that's what I use for my chisels. Moving on to the saw section now. So if I'd set this up years ago when I was apprentice, you would have seen a nice wooden handled panel saw here. I can't remember what make I used to have now, but yeah, it was really nice. And the company that I worked for, we never actually sharpened them ourselves. We sent all our machine blades and hand tools to be sharpened off by a company, and they used to bring them back. So I never actually learned how to sharpen a saw myself. I saw it done, but yeah, you would have seen a nice wooden handle panel saw here. But now these days everyone's using disposables, which is okay, they're cheap enough. I normally stick to one brand, just because you get to know the feel of one saw and how it works, and you know how much pressure you need to put on it and all such, and keeping it in the straight line. So I just use a cheap disposable saw these days. I normally go for a 22-inch blade, just because they're a bit longer and I can get more of a, yeah, I just like the longer length to get more of a drive on it. So that's really what I use these days for that. Coping saw is always in my toolkit. This is the only one I've ever had. So this one's nearly 30 years old as well. I always use a coping saw, just because I think that's just the way I've been taught. These days a lot of the stuff is done on a jigsaw, which I do as well, but I do still use a coping saw quite a bit, especially if I'm doing skirtings and doing scribes on skirtings. I always still use a coping saw rather than a jigsaw, just because I get to know the feel of it, and I can stay within the line easier. So yeah, I always use one of these, and this is the very first one I ever had. Also, hacksaw blade. I've got a big one like this, and I've got a smaller one, a junior one. Yeah, it's handy to have if you're doing door locks. Sometimes you've got to cut spindles down. You need to cut bits of metal every now and then as a carpenter, mainly on second fix for door locks and front door locks and things like that. You don't need to spend a lot of money on a hacksaw. A hacksaw's a hacksaw, so that's that one as well. And also another one that's quite handy is a pad saw. This one is cheap as anything, cheap as cheap could be. It's handy for cutting out plasterboard. This one's no good for cutting timber, because I just use this one for plasterboard now, but I have got another one that's sharper that can cut through timber as well. But these are quite handy to have just for cutting holes in things that you need to. So yeah, that is the saw range. A couple of other things that are always in my toolkit are my marking gauge. This one is cheap. This is the only one I've ever had since I was an apprentice. Yeah, it's not expensive at all, but it's a good essential thing to have. I normally use this now these days for marking out hinges really on doors, and occasionally if you've got to do the odd joint on site, then I use that as well. But it's handy to have. It's just one of those things that I've just sort of grown up with as a carpenter, and I still use now. So I'd say it's a pretty good thing to have, just mainly even for marking out hinges. It's really handy for that. The other thing is sliding bevel. Again, I've had this one since I was an apprentice. It's not a basic one, it did cost a bit more money, just because it holds better the more expensive they are, rather than a plastic one. This one's wooden. And I use this mainly if I'm doing roofing. I will use that for doing my angles on a roof, sometimes for skirting, but mainly on roofs I use that for. So that is something else that you could put in your toolkit. Next thing is my auger bits. This one hasn't been out for a while, but yeah, I've always got a set of auger bits as well in my toolkit. I've had these since I was an apprentice as well. These are the first ones I ever bought. You can get them sharpened, so these are still good. I use this one for doing front door locks, like the Yale locks. It's the right size for doing that. And then I've just got a set that I use for, I kind of like using auger bits for doing door locks with, just because it sort of pulls into the door and it clears the timber out a bit better than flat bits. I have got flat bits as well, but I'm kind of used to using these when I'm doing locks, so I use these quite often now, still, when I'm doing locks. So yeah, you could get yourself a set of auger bits if you want to. Not essential, but I just thought I'd show you these. Apart from that one, these are all original, so these are nearly 30 years old as well. And again, in a cheap bit roll that doesn't cost much at all, just to keep them all safe. And then the last thing that we got is the good old pouch. Trusty old pouch. Again, this one, I think I've only owned 2 pouches in my whole career. This one I've had for over 20 years. And what I do in this one is I just keep my tape, I keep my knife, my pencil and my hammer, and kind of whatever fixings I need to use at the time. So at the moment they're just full of screws that I've been using. It was it wasn't that hugely expensive, but it was not cheap. So I would say if it's one of those things as well that you're going to keep hopefully for your whole career. I mean, this one's so lovely and soft now, and it sort of forms around your body, and all the pockets are nice and loose and supple. The only thing I've had to do is, you know, over the years, is make the waist a little bit wider so that it will fit around my tummy. But apart from that, it all stays the same. A couple of things I would suggest is make sure that it's got a good hook on it. This one's got a metal clasp, which never comes undone. And the other thing that I like about this one is the hook ring for your hammer. It's a nice sturdy metal hook ring, so that you know you can get your hammer in and out quite easily. And that's it really for a pouch. I mean, you don't need one of these ones that's, you know, got a million pockets on it, and you know it's got braces on it that are, you know, that are full of pockets as well. And you know, you get these guys that have got every single tool that they own on their belt, because they've got such a massive pouch that they need to fill it up. You don't really need that. Just get yourself a simple pouch with the simple things on it. Just make sure it's got a good hook and a good clasp on the back and a couple of pockets, and you'll be set. So I just wanted to finish this clip just with a couple of tips that might help you, and that is to practice your hand skills whenever you can. These days we live in a world where you know, everything is battery operated or it's electric. There's so many power tools that you can use to help you out, which is good. I'm all up for things saving time and, you know, for being quicker and to help you out. But I find it amazing that I see these guys that, you know, that are starting up and have been in it 3, 4, 5 years as a carpenter, and they've got all the power tools, but they don't know how to use a hammer because they're always using the nail gun. And you ask them to hammer something in, and they're all over the place with it. They can't hit the head of a nail because they don't really practice it, or they never have practiced it. Same with sawing as well. You know, we're always using power tools and cordless circular saws, but sometimes you ask a guy to cut a bit of 4x2 square, and he's all over the place with it because they've never had the years of practice, you know, like people like me that have had, where we never had power tools to start with. Everything was done by hand. So you get to know that feeling, you get to know that get your eye in and keep it straight. And the same with chiseling as well. Like if I'm hanging a door or 2 doors, I will still naturally just go for my set of chisels to cut the hinges in, because I know that by the time I've got my router out, set up some sort of jig, marked everything out for the sake of 1 or 2 doors, I could have chopped the hinges in by now by hand, just because I know how to do it and how to do it quickly. But you get guys that don't know how to do that because they always use a router, which is okay, but when it comes down to hand skills, for me that's kind of where it's at with a carpenter. So for me, I've started with everything by hand, and I've learned the other way, where I've learned how to use power tools and how to adapt and make things easier and learn how to do it that way. So I'd say, if you can, whenever you can, just practice your hand skills. It doesn't even have to be on a door. You can just get a lump of timber and practice chopping out hinges and using your hammer as much as you can, and sawing timber whenever you get the opportunity, to use a hand saw rather than a crosscut saw, or a skill saw. So yeah, hopefully you found this clip helpful. If you're just starting out, we will see you next time on Everywhere Tools.